Alrighty, my friends. Hello, hello. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time of day you are choosing to watch this series of videos. So if you're watching this for my environmental science class, we are now in week 10, perhaps, depending, of course, on the semester that you might be taking this. But in this week, we are going to be looking at reading through and looking at module 5.3, which is managing solid waste, which might seem a little gross, might seem a little bit weird, but it's something that we as a species have to contend with and have to deal with. Your book is going to go further into things like microplastics, which is a basically broken down part of larger plastics. Like this is an Nalgene bottle, right? So say that this would just break down over time and little tiny, and like could be, if it's in the oceans, it would be like this would be heated up by the sun, battered up by waves, and just be broken down and no longer usable. Plastics are great in a sense because it's durable, it's cheap, it's easy to use, and we have it in everything, right? But unfortunately, there are consequences to plastics as well, right? So we're going to dive into kind of how we, as a community, as a species, deal with our waste and deal with our trash. Not to be confused with like our bodily waste. We're going to be talking about our stuff waste. All right. So this will be broken down into, of course, several different videos. Starting with, of course, our lovely open page here of, managing solid waste. So waste, what a concept, right? And there's no waste in natural ecosystems, right? So when other creatures eat things or dispose of things or whatever, it's naturally kind of put back into the environment, and it's not a bad thing. Even when you die, you decompose and everything gets like renourished back into the earth, and it's all a circular system. However, for humanity, not so much, right? So we have all of this stuff. From the day you were born until the day you die, you have an accumulation of things. And sometimes those things break, sometimes they break down, like even clothes, right? Or grow out of them, go through phases, whatever it is. So we have to get rid of that waste in some way, shape, form, or another. And if you recall, there's this sort of similar to the laws of thermodynamics, that energy is neither created nor destroyed. Matter is also neither created nor destroyed, and we'll get to that actually on the next slide. But it continues to be used in other forms, right? You can also think of like fossil fuels, right? In our previous module, we talked about, or our previous modules, we talked about how we take carbon from one reservoir from fossil fuels, and we take it and we burn it, right? And so we utilize, reutilize something from something else. We create it into something else. So waste is purely a human concept. No other species on our planet creates waste like we do. So as I alluded to before, this conservation of matter, the law of the conservation of matter, right? So because it's neither created nor destroyed, it of course can change form. Thus, we're really like never actually getting rid of anything. Instead, we're hiding it away somewhere or changing it into another form. So we're going to talk about those ways in which we hide it in other locations around the world. So you've probably heard of this term biodegradable. It's where things can break down over time by living organisms. Things like bacteria or fungus kind of break these things down, right? Food is for the most part biodegradable. I had a bag of lemons earlier that I get from Imperfect Foods, which I'll talk about later on. But one of the lemons was pretty much completely rotten on one side, right? So there was this mold, there was this fungus growing on the outside of it, breaking that lemon down. Whereas things that are non-biodegradable, those cannot be broken down by any chemical, physical, or biological reactions. And this is through mostly synthetic molecules. So things like plastics that I mentioned before, we don't really fully know how long it takes plastic to break down. A human hasn't been around long enough to be able to actually physically see plastic break down over its lifetime, though scientists at the moment do believe that plastics take about a couple thousand years, I think, to fully break down, which is not great, right? And we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that later on. So of course, we got to talk about some statistics, right? I hate practicing statistics, but it is always a fun, interesting thing to look at. So the United States in and of itself produces over 11 billion tons of solid waste annually. And we have things called non-municipal waste like mining and agriculture and industrial waste. And I think in more modern times as well, we have something called electronic waste. And this is a topic that's becoming more and more prevalent as we continue to advance our technologies. You could even consider things like electric vehicles, right? So there's these arguments against electric vehicles because what do we do with that battery once it's done? There's not a way to recycle that lithium and uranium. So like what is going on? So those are industries that are kind of, I think, popping up a bit more. So we're going to be talking about waste in this acronym MSW, so municipal solid waste. Is really only about 1 to 3% of the amount of waste that we create. So it's important because we have direct control over that type of waste, and it ends up being a huge amount of waste. So what a waste, right? So many ways to consider the term waste. So how much MSW do we create here in the United States? So some staggering statistics, right? So on average, each American in 2021 created 4.9 pounds of trash per day. And if you do a little bit of math on it, 4.9 times 365 days per year, right? So that generates, can just do this real quick. I think it's like about 1,000 pounds or so in a year, 365, 1,788.5 pounds per year, which if you then multiply that by the population of the US, which is about 335 million, that gets us to this value of about 299 million tons per year of trash in the United States as a whole, right? So part of your assignment for this week actually is to do these last two bullet points. What's in your trash can, right? So how much do you dispose of? I encourage you to go take a look and perhaps note how much of it is still usable. Could it be reusable, compostable, recyclable, right? So things to consider with your own trash, with your own waste, with your own footprint, basically. So we have a couple graphs here on the right-hand side. This is looking at the MSW generation rates from 1960 to 2015. This is an infographic from your book. So we can look at the blue line is total MSW generation, and the orangish line here is per capita generation. So we can see we're starting to kind of level things off a little bit, and I think that's a good step in the right direction. But, we're still a species that's growing in size and creating more and more waste. And then on the right-hand side here in this pie chart, it's kind of a breakdown of all of the solid waste that we generate. Most of it being paper. And then another good chunk of it being food. We waste an enormous amount of food in this country, which is wild to think about. And if anyone here works in the service industry, like in restaurants, or catering or anything like that, you may be very well aware of how much food you have to throw away. And then, of course, yard trimmings, plastics, rubber, leather, and textiles, metals, wood, glass, and then other. So it's really, really quite fascinating, I think, to really fully break these things down. So how much waste is that, right? So in the US, every year we create enough waste to put 1 ounce of trash on every single square foot of our land and water surfaces. That's gross, right? Think about how nasty that is. And then think about how large our country is. We are blessed to live in such a large country. And if you've ever done any road trips or been around, it's like, oh my gosh, that is a lot. Oh, hello, microphone, coming to say hi. So breaking this down a little bit further, I want you to try to take a closer look at this graph. So what does each line mean? It kind of, looks like we were starting to improve a little bit, but most of that dip was because of economic downturn, right? So if you're not buying as much stuff, you can't throw away as much stuff, right? If that makes sense. Perhaps that's something that you are experiencing today with inflation and in this economy. who can afford to buy anything, right? So of course then people bought less stuff and had less municipal solid waste. But we can do better, right? So let's keep on trying to reduce these numbers. And so, again, breaking this idea down of what our waste is composed of, and what's really wild is a lot of this is either recyclable or compostable, right? Roughly over 60% of this could be considered as biodegradable, right? Could be broken down by things like bacteria and fungus. And this statistic here, the packaging is about 1/3 of our waste stream and about 1/2 of all of our paper use. So it's kind of wild, right, to think about. And I feel like a lot of our packaging needs really increased with the pandemic, right? A lot of us were ordering things online because stores weren't open. A lot of us were getting takeout. I think thankfully here in California and San Francisco, a lot of the takeout packaging has to be compostable or recyclable. I think it's a really good step in the right direction, but not everywhere in the country is like that, right? So it's really fascinating just to think about various parts of your life and how much waste is generated within said part. So in our next set of videos, we will look at specifically how we manage and get rid of our waste. Thank you so much for watching.